Welcome, everybody. My name is David Kramer. I am the director of the library at the Jewish Theological Seminary, and this is the second of a four-part series that's being sponsored by the library, devoted to Jewish music from one perspective or another. I've got to give credit where credit is due. This whole program began with an idea from our presenter tonight, Chazan Matt Austerklein, who is doing his PhD in Jewish music. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment as I do the official introduction, but he got in touch. And I don't remember, did you first get in touch with Nancy, was it? I don't remember what the direction was.
I don't remember, but we're here.
But we're here, we are. And what began as an idea for one program expanded to two, and then we said, let's do a series, and we're really thrilled about it. Matt's motivation, I think it's fair to say, you'll correct me when you begin. Your motivation was because you wanted to tell us something about your very, very interesting research, and your research does have some ties to the holdings of the JTS library. We've got music archives and other music holdings, and we're very, very proud of our music collections. And so one of our, honestly, self-promotions is to the world is to let people know that the library is a place to come, not just for literary research, not just for technical, historical, rabbinic research, all the other kinds, but we've got holdings in Jewish music as well. So Matt, thank you for giving us this opportunity.
My pleasure. I would not be doing a PhD in Jewish studies today if when I was fiercely in need of a master's thesis topic when I was in cantorial school, there weren't ample sources, not of music, sheet music per se, but in the history of Jewish leadership and specifically the history of the cantorate.
Yeah,
but I'll talk more about this
thank
later.
you. We're really, as I say, grateful. This is the second of these programs. The first one was last week, and it was on the occasion of Yom HaShoah. It featured a presentation and composition by our faculty member, Chazan Gerald Cohen, very distinguished piece. And if you're interested in that, please find it through the JTS website. And listen, it was a fantastic program, and I have no doubt that tonight's program will be equally as fantastic. Before I begin with the introduction, let me just say that, there it is. Let me just say that I will keep everybody muted over the course of the presentation. I will spotlight our presenter, so his is the image that you can see. And if you want to ask questions, we will reserve some minutes at the end for questions, but the way to ask questions will be to send them to me via the chat function, and I will keep track of questions and I will convey them to Matt when he's finished with his presentation. He won't have to pay attention to them, it'll be distracting to him, so I'll be able to look at that. Chazan Matthew Austerklein is the cantor of the Beth El congregation in Akron, Ohio. He earned his Masters of Sacred Music and Cantorial ordination from JTS in 2011. He's the editor of two books, including Ilufinu, A Cappella for Jewish Prayer, the first ever book of Jewish liturgical music in contemporary a cappella style. I remember, Matt, when you were doing a cappella at JTS, it was a pleasure to listen to. His writings have been featured in the Journal of Synagogue Music, Hebrew College Community Blog, and the Times of Israel. Chazan Austerklein is now a PhD candidate in Jewish studies at the Martin Luther University in Halle-Wittenberg in Germany, where he's writing a doctorate, and his dissertation examines the musical specialization of Ashkenazi cantors from 1500 to 1800, analyzing the genesis of cantorial thought and musical professionalism. And his presentation tonight will relate to the work that he's doing. Let me spotlight you and hand it all over to you. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kramer, and good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me tonight for this talk. It's particularly touching to see members of my home community in Akron, from my former community in Bethesda, Maryland, and of course my fellow cantorial colleagues as well. So we're going to get started with the lecture in just a second, but I like to start, because this is a lecture about music and with people who like music, I like to start by singing. So I'm going to open with a niggin. You're all muted, so you can feel like you're singing right with me. So we'll just open with a niggin together, which I'll teach, and then we'll dive into our subject for today. Da 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 da, ay ay da dum. Do 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 do, ay ay da dum. Do 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 do, hi dai dai, di dai 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 dai, ya da da dum. Di dai 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 ay dai dai, ay ay da dum. Di da 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 ya da da, ya da dum. Da 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 da, ay ay da, ay 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 ay, ya na na na, ay na na, ay da da do, ay ay, ay na na, ay na na, ay ay. Ay na na, ay day day, ay day day, ay 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 ay, da da dum, ti da 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 da, ay ay da dum, ti do 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 do, ya na na dum, ti dum dum da 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 da. Hi dai dai, hi bye bye, ba ba bum. Hi ay ay na na, ay nay nay nay, ay ay, ay na na, ay nay nay nay, ay ay, ay na na, ay nay nay, ay ay ay. Ay 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 da da dum, ti do 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 do, ay da dum, ti da 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 da, ay ti da 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 da, ay ay ay, ay ay ay, mama mum.
Beautiful, Matt. I could hear voices from all over the country.
I could see some mouths moving, so it made me feel together with you, which is one of the things that music does. And if you like, I invite you to just put in the chat one sentence about what, for you and your experience, what music does. What things does it enact? What does it do when it happens, right? What are its possibilities? If your people want to put a few things in the chat, you're welcome to. I'm getting some questions too, which is good. One of the things I wanted to speak about tonight is that music operates on us consciously and unconsciously in expressing deep things. It can elevate us, it can fill our soul, it can harmonize us, it can lift our spirit. Thank you everyone who's putting comments there. It can, bring us, together, or it could connect us simply vertically with our Creator or with our own personal spirituality. There's such deep things that go on. So often we think about music as a question of taste. He likes this, she likes that. This is personal choice. One's desire for music could be seen as one's just girsa de yankista, right? It's just what you get in your upbringing, and it sticks with you your whole life. But my experience says that many of the deep questions behind music are often forgotten. We say, oh, this was so spiritual. But what does that actually mean? We call this other style, oh, that was a performance. But we don't ask, what is a performance? What is it for? And how do the different musical experiences that we have call forth different aspects of the Kodesh Baruch Hu and who God is, and simultaneously embody different models of human community? This is a long way of saying that music is always saying a lot more than we think. And to share one of my favorite quotes, I'm going to open my PowerPoint here. And if I can get that up and running. Everyone see a very bright quote by Arthur Schopenhauer? Yes, music is an unconscious exercise in metaphysics in which the mind is unaware that it is philosophizing. So this is, I think, a very beautiful quote and very apt for today. Now today, I'm going to speak about cantors and how a striking era of cantorial innovation from 1500 to 1800 or so brought about new and exciting and potentially subversive possibilities for how God and community could be experienced through sound. But to explore this, we need to start with a midrash. There's a famous midrash. Famous depending, if you're at Hadar, it's famous. There are other places it might not be famous. It's a famous midrash on Parshat Lech Lecha, which is the story of the Birah Doleket. It tells of how Avraham Avinu, Abraham, our ancestor, found faith in God. There are many versions of this midrash, and they both work via analogy, and they both go roughly like this. There's two kind of main factions of this midrash. They both go roughly like this. It's like a person who was traveling in the desert and found a birah doleket, a building aglow or possibly on fire. Would it be possible for that person to say that this birah, this building, has no master? So too, said Avraham Avinu, is it possible that this world, as I see it, has no master? Now, one version of this story in Mishnat Rabbi Eliezer takes this birah doleket as a vision of order. The word doleket is understood in the sense of glowing, beautiful, right? The image on the left. And Abraham's faith comes from discovering God's natural design. How could it be, says Abraham, that this ordered world has no creator? But in another earlier version of this story in Breshit Rabbah, Abraham's discovery of God comes from seeing the world as a very different type of birah doleket, a building, or like a tenement house, is the original translation of birah in this period, a tenement house on fire. One would think by looking at the world, says Abraham in this version, that the world has no supervisor. At that point, the Kodesh Baruch Hu, the Lord, comes out and says, I am the owner of the entire world. So in this, Abraham's faith then comes as a spiritual response to a fundamental experience of the world as disorderly and chaotic. So what is this world? A house aglow or a building on fire? It's the same words, birah doleket. And just as the word doleket has been understood in Jewish tradition as both aglow or on fire, different people can look at the world and see, or are drawn to, one of these two visions. Now, why am I talking about this tonight? The implications of these visions are both glowing and smoldering in music itself. The Pythagorean way of understanding music, which began with the Greeks, and I owe this insight to Ted Gioia in his recent book, Music, A Subversive History. The Pythagorean way of understanding music, which began with the Greeks, it was continued and institutionalized in Greek music theory, in both European Christianity and parts of Islam, envisions the world as one of order. Music is one of the 7 sciences whose noble apprehension and study brings one closest to God, the ultimate creator of order. Things like scales and tonality and tuning emerge from natural mathematical relationships observable in the created world. In this worldview, the world is fundamentally in harmony, and so too is its music. A beautiful Renaissance piece like this by Monteverdi, as it is, in this pristine setting with written sheet music and trained singers, may sound and look like the work of a musical aristocracy. But we should also understand that music on the Pythagorean model exists across strata of medieval and early modern Christian societies, such as we'll see Jews and cantors operating in today. And this includes improvised folk music, polyphony, street melodies, as well as the composed artistic music of the court. But let's listen, however, to how Jews are depicted by their traditional Catholic contemporaries in this era as a contrast to the world of harmony. As Professor Ruta Cohen demonstrates in her book, The Music Libel Against the Jews, this is a fascinating book, and I highly recommend it. Jews across many parts, not all, but many parts of Christian history were seen as demonstrably lesser than, morally and culturally, through their distinct lack of harmony. Christian visitors to the synagogue remarked that their worship sounded more like the hum of bees, right? Right? And they heard that. And their music was not music, but noise. Listen here to this Hebraica. This is a Jew song. I may be the first person at a JTS lecture to play an actual anti-Semitic, or vaguely, or actually directly, anti-Semitic song from history, but this is one of them. This is a Jew song from a Commedia dell'arte by the famous Italian composer Orazio Vecchi, a contemporary of Leon de Modena and Salomone Rossi, who attempts to parody Jews at prayer. Let me skip ahead a little bit to where the Jews start praying. Okay, here we go. Hear the Jews? So we see and notice here that Jews, to Christians at this time, sound not just nasal and uttering random Hebrew syllables, although not so random because they're hearing things like Baruch Haba, which was very in the streets in Italy. They would hear them at circumcisions, Baruch Haba, and it actually became a thing in Jew songs. But you could even hear you could also hear that Jews sound disordered. This is a poor version of a fugue. You can hear the Italian phrase at the beginning of the excerpt we played, the Italian phrase for making a ruckus in this period, fare synagoga. They're making a shul up in there. And Juden shul, this is not just in Italy, this is in Germany as well. And funnily enough, Ashkenazi Jews are going to later come back and complain about their own cantors for being too disorderly in just this way, perhaps having taken on a greater desire for harmony themselves. So, the main point is this. Harmony versus disharmony, order versus chaos, perfection versus imperfection, music versus noise, musical hierarchy versus music of equity. These are some of the dichotomies, and they don't always line up with each other at the same time. We have all sorts of combinations of them. These are some of the dichotomies that define the exploding world of musical innovation that arises in the European Ashkenazi synagogue before the Enlightenment, in the era of 1500 to 1800. Ashkenazi cantors will experiment with Chochmat HaMuzika, the Western science of music, its sounds and techniques, both written and improvised, and begin to claim it as their own as they emerge as a professionalized musical class, spending more and more time in the study of music, in sometimes deeply pious ways and in sometimes deeply transgressive ways. The stakes for these cantors are high. How will they balance this new focus with the high religious standards of their office? How will they add additional singers for the music, meshorerim, to the service, while ensuring that these new singers also reflect the same standards as the Shliach Sipur? Will their musical innovations lead to tediousness and detached musical elitism, or to a magnified inspiration that powerfully cleaves the souls of worshipers to God? These both pious and subversive opportunities of specialized music come alive for early modern cantors in Europe. And for the next 40 minutes, I'm going to take you through some important highlights which have come up in my own dissertation research, through books, pictures, broadsheets, songs, and even plays. Through this, I hope we'll gain some insights on the dynamics in which are very much alive in Jewish life right now, as well as learn valuable lessons about our first question, what music can do. So let's start in one of the great cantorial cities in early modern Europe, and that is Prague. Hands up. I can't see everyone's hands, but if you've been to Prague, have your hands up. I was in Prague for like 4 hours on my way to Berlin. I studied in Vienna, Austria, which is where I fell in love with chazonis. And so I've been to Prague a little bit, but I've mostly been to Prague a lot in books. Prague. Some cities are just good for music. There's a perfect storm that makes expression and music desirable. Vienna, Odessa, New York, Cleveland. Well, Prague is definitely one of those cities, especially for Jewish music and cantors. Beginning in the 16th century, Prague's Jews equipped each of their 9 synagogues with organs, and even engaged special orchestras for the accompaniment of the Chadodi for hour-long concerts prior to sundown. Sound familiar? This is the original Friday Night Live, right? The city featured singing societies, the Baruch Shamar singers who made special melodies inspired by the prayer's mysticism since the Middle Ages. The Chevra Kadisha even had its own singing society. And the epitaphs of Prague's Jewish gravestones describe many cantors, meshorerim, and Jews who sang, play instruments, and who were competent in chokhmat hamuzika, in the science of music. So let's take a look at some of these Jews on an auspicious day in the spring of 1716. On a parade put on by the entire Prague Jewish community in honor of the birth of the Habsburg Prince Leopold occurs. In this large centerfold from the Bodleian Library in Oxford, printed in a Yiddish booklet commemorating the event. Is this a cool picture? You can see, I mean, I don't know if gigantic Kohanim were there, number 22, but everyone else I think was really there. You can see here a confident Jewish community, separate but strong and celebrating a royal birth. You can see on the top of number 1, on the big kind of sukkah thing, and in the archway, on the trompet or the shalmai, you can see klezmer musicians playing, and children and rabbis and public officials, groups from across the Jewish community marching. This is, by the way, the second known parade of this nature. Another happened in the 1670s, and another's going to happen again in the 1740s. And where are the chazonim? Here they are, a beautiful number 19. You see their hats. I wish the cantors' hats were like that, with like the long brimmed thing. Number 19, you can see them holding some music that they're singing. And in Western Yiddish on the bottom, it reads, I'll just read the translation. This is Old Yiddish, this is Western Yiddish, and more like German. It says, then 4 people came carrying an organ, the organ on which was played upon by Rabbi Henela ben Rab Mordechai Bas. So we have a rabbi on a movable organ, and then it says, Oich bei der Folgen alle chazonim mikol basei knesses dekilosenu. All the cantors of every synagogue in our community come, and they pleasantly sing and make music together with the organ. We even have evidence after this that we actually have, there's a special Misha Berach, which I think is number 20 for the monarch, which is right there. And there's even a kids choir who comes in later. Why is this so cool? For me, it's amazing to see Chazonim here as a professionalized group, praying and singing with a musical rav on organ, no less, as part of their own community's celebration of a secular political event. It shows you their sense of unity as musical representatives of a greater community, and that they have their own part to play. Now, we'll learn more about their community and their sense of togetherness, or how that can fracture, actually, in the reports of Rabbi Shlomo Lifshitz, a cantor who was the prize pupil of the chief rabbi of Prague, the famous book collector and court Jew, Rabbi David Oppenheim, and who served as the chief cantor of Prague, the Chazan de Mate, for a decade. He wrote here, and if you read Hebrew, this is actually not so bad. It's fun to read in the Hebrew. I left it for you. I will translate. He wrote this in his epic cantorial manual, which I'll mention later, to Dutch Shlomo, about the Prague community during his decade there, in both the positive and the negative. He says, as for me, and if you want to debate my translation, I welcome you to do it offline or privately in the chat. It's fine. As for me, when I was a communal chazan of the holy community Kila Kedosha of Prague, the elders of the generation said, that a while ago all the chazanim were together in love and brotherhood and peace and friendship. And this was evident by the fact they would study together and ask questions of Yom Tov a few days before the holiday. Pesach lost on Pesach, Passover lost on Passover, sorry, I just said that. Shemini Atzeret lost on Atzeret, Sukkot lost on Sukkot, and on the high holidays, all the customs and melodies in their appropriate places. And there were among them some chazanim who were skillful in chokhmat hamuzika, the science of music, and every festival they would write melodies mechadesh b'chol yom, renewed every morning. And there were other chazanim who learned the melodies from them, v'hodu v'lo boshu, and they were thankful, and they were not embarrassed. But now, oy vavoy is not written there, it's not that way. Everyone builds a bama le'atzmo, a stage for himself, and wraps himself in someone else's talit, which means that you have no fear of heaven, and does not want to study from his friend anymore, saying, who is so-and-so that I should go study with him? I myself, ani zamer tov, I'm a good singer, he should come study with me. And everyone in his own eyes is like Navot and Hogus ben Levi, who knew Perek Bashir, who knew a chapter about song, but didn't know the sugiyot, didn't know the details of the masters of song, specifically the science of music. Bifrat chokhmat hamuzika. And by the way, for the Jewish music knowledgeable, he quotes all immediately following this the entirety of the introduction to Rossi's Shir Hashirim Asher Shlomo, all of the haskamot by the rabbis of Venice to the art music of Salomoni Rossi in its entirety, which means to me he must have owned a copy. And indeed, there is a copy of it in the Bodleian Library, which was and which I'll actually talk about later. So what have we learned? In Prague, the cantorate is becoming a professional community with, at one point, organized Jewish study and musical innovation from trusted leaders. But according to Rabbi Shlomo, egos and reputations are beginning to get in the way. When cantors become involved in musical innovation and artistic music, fraternity is possible, but competition is a temptation. Now, I think this is really relevant for today's world, right? When you're trying to make something beautiful, there is a temptation to compete with others. And so, the situation in Prague is not unlike the normal upsides and downsides of artistic music today. When someone leads a prayer or sings with exceptional beauty, was it about them? Or was it about something greater? Here we learn that, and this is perhaps my opinion, the more one adds in musical complexity, the more one must be careful to avoid the ego and competition. This is perhaps why King David gave sacred music to the Temple Levites, a musical guild who spent their time close to God and ever in the presence of music, and the priests, who were the teachers of Torah. But more about those guys later. Prague was also known to Jews and non-Jewish visitors for its instrumental music tradition. We mentioned before the instrumental ensembles, the Friday Night Live for Kabbalat Shabbat. Look at the Prague Jewish cemeteries and you'll find both cantors and klezmer musicians whose abilities on musical instruments are immortalized in stone. And this is true outside of Prague as well. Why was this so important? One of the new ideas in this era was Lurianic Kabbalah, with its emphasis on banishing sadness and doing all mitzvot with simcha, with joy. Especially on Shabbat, with its new hit poem, Lecha Dodi, joy is a religious mandate. We read in the Bible about music's ability to bring prophecy or banish depression. And so now under Kabbalah, musical instruments are helping to renew simcha in the world. So we should not be surprised that inspiring joy through music is one of the things that people want on their tombstone. This is maybe a very old idea, right? But of course, it's a very contemporary idea and a very Hasidic idea. Remember, the Baal Shem Tov is having his bar mitzvah at the time, around the time that Rabbi Shlomo Lifshitz is writing the words we saw before. Religious joy is as important now as it was then. As we see, Rabbi Art Green just included it as one of the 10 great concepts of our religion in his book, Judaism's 10 Best Ideas. So joy is back with a bang. But it isn't the only thing that is important for cantors specifically about Kabbalah. Kabbalah makes the cantor's job super important in this era because it elevates prayer to almost the same level as study. Saying the sacred mystical words and intentions of the prayer book gives the prayer cosmic power. Indeed, this level of meticulousness in detail leads many to write about the role of Shliach Tzibor as Bimkom Kohen Gadol, right? The meticulousness of the priest is required for the efficacy of Kabbalistic prayer. Now we're going to see that priest image come back a little bit later too. The cantor has a cosmic role, right? He has to have exacting words and exacting kavanot, intentions, and thought to create unity between God and his Shekhinah, bringing the redemption of the entire world. Prayer is more than ever a high-stakes activity. And yet, for this very purpose, cantors are willing to learn new technology, the science of music, chokhmat hamuzika, to achieve new levels of piety, to make sure that joy is created within the congregation and that God's worship is as beautiful as possible. Many of us know Salomone Rossi's 1623 Hebrew madrigals for the synagogue, but less of us know that at least one copy of the quinto part, so one of the choral parts, made it into the hands of an Ashkenazi cantor in Nikolsburg in Moravia, in who in the early 18th century, after practicing his solfege, which you can see, this by the way is, I haven't gotten a scan of this from the Bodleian yet, this is in the Bodleian library, but this is the transcription of everything by Israel Adler, who documented all the manuscripts of Hebrew related to Jews and music that we have. So on the part of it, he's practicing his solfege, right? Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, si, do. Except back then, it wasn't do, it was ut. It got changed to do at another period in time. That's why you see ut at the top. More to the point, he writes in the margin when he gets this book that the Lord favored him to study this book of music for the sake of the unity of the Kodesh Baruch Hu and Shekhinah, to chant songs and praise in the synagogue, and to exalt him bekol he'adar, with a voice of exaltation or beauty. Note, bekol he'adar is in the same root as hidur, like hidur mitzvah, which is one of the things that music is all about. So we see in this Kabbalistic and religious desire to make worship joyful and to use the best techniques at one's disposal, including chokhmat hamuzika, the science of music, and musical artistry in general, using new musical tech to realize religious goals. But it is these very tools and opportunities of musical artistry which simultaneously threaten to profane the emotional precision of mystical prayer. Perhaps nowhere does this debate get hotter than in our next stop, Amsterdam. And it is in this area that JTS has its finest library holdings, which I will share with you a little bit today. Meet this man on the left. Yechiel Michel ben Natan, Me Lublin, originally from Lublin in western Poland. It says Me Russia, if you can read the Hebrew on the bottom. You can see him here in this Dutch etching by Pieter van der Berg. Yechiel became one of the cantors at the Great Synagogue of Amsterdam in 1700 and is credited as having introduced meshorerim, that is, choristers, the bass and the zinger. And you can see them, by the way, in the background of the picture, and introducing them into the Great Synagogue for the first time, which created a gigantic controversy. The meshorerim, of which we will learn, were a polyvocal ensemble. It wasn't like choirs we think of today. They alternated singing with the cantor, often in a more extended musical style. Well, this innovation created problems, which came to a head during the short-lived tenure of the top right, such a gentle Rebbe, Rabbi Aryeh Leib Kalish, pictured on the top right, who began a much beloved yeshiva in Amsterdam. He became the chief rabbi in 1708, and just 1 year later, this conflagration occurred, reported by Rabbi Jacob Emden in his autobiographical Megillat Sefer. At that time, the community was torn by fierce dissension, caused by the notorious incident of the two Chazanim, Reb Lamed and Reb Yud. Many lives had been ruined and much money lost over this quarrel several years. Indeed, the situation had reached such an impasse that on Shabbos Shuvah in 1709, the two factions who contended as to which of the two aforementioned Chazanim should officiate in the Great Synagogue came to physical blows. They threw and pushed lecterns at one another, and it seemed they intended to cause fatal injury to one another. For our many sins, this Beit HaKnesset, a mikdash me'at, this synagogue became a den of terrorists. I skip a little. But because of the great trepidation and terror that affected this aforementioned rabbi on that particular occasion, he became seriously ill, and returning to his house, he never recovered, for he was struck by a fatal illness. Oy vavoy, we think synagogue politics is bad today. Now a little more about this incident. We know the second cantor in question was Aryeh Leib ben Zev Wolf, who was the cantor of the second Ashkenazi synagogue. His father had come from Habelberg in Bavaria and served as cantor in the community in the Great Synagogue from 1671 through 1710, through this time. So he and his father and the other chazan were serving at the same time. So, this looks like perhaps a fight between a traditional German Ashkenazi cantorial family, who's been in town for a while, and an upstart Polish musical innovator, which leads to blows and the new rabbi dying of stress-related illness. Following the rabbi's death, by the way, the community landers ban the bass from the synagogue for a time, and Chazan Yechiel leaves the community just 3 years later. What can we learn from this sad tale? Perhaps we're seeing the downside of two phenomena that we should recognize in our own day, and these are the clash of Jewish cultures and the role of choirs in worship. The tension between Polish and Ashkenaz Jews, that is German Jews, I'm calling them Ashkenaz, they are Ashkenazi Jews, but in this culture they're German Jews, is quite known in this period of time. Polish rabbis and cantors moved west following the Chemnitsky massacres of 1649, and even before that, for financial reasons. Eastern sound was newly discernible in Western synagogues, and it was the stuff of folk legend associated with great emotional power. Natan of Hanover, in his book The Yev Mitzula, reports a story of Chazan Hirsch of Zviotov. Through his emotional chanting of the El Mole Rachamim, the memorial prayer, is reported to have moved the Tartars to not schmeist 3,000 Jews. Rabbi Zelig Margolis of Kalish, in his Chibur Lekutim in 1715, describes this quality of Eastern chazonis, of chazanut, as moving people to tears even more, he says, than rabbinic preaching. Rabbi Margolis adds that such ability is possessed by chazanim in our Polish country only, whereas in other countries, the chazanim have neither melody nor emotion. Now, tension between German Ashkenazi and Polish Jews is a well-known phenomenon in this era, and those of you who know American history in the 20th century know that it ain't absent then either, right? The German Jews come in the 1840s, then the dirty Ostjuden come in the 1880s, and they fight about different things for many years. We see this in this era in the Yiddish satire Beschreibung von Ashkenaz und Polik, published in Prague in 1675, which is this, the German Jew says, oh, you guys come begging at our door, and then the Polish Jew says, you guys don't have any learning, you need our rabbis and cantors to help you. So we have that, and then on the left we actually have what's called the Chazonim Spiel. This is an 18th century Purim Spiel that compares the gastronomic preferences of Ashkenazi, Polish, and Aval, and Tedesco, which is Italo-Ashkenazi Jews. Unfortunately, we only have just a little snippet of this. I would have loved to have seen the whole thing. In Amsterdam specifically, Polish immigrants had been in ascendancy for the last half of the 17th century, and there was bitter tension between them and the German Ashkenazi Jews, and that temperature rose even further when they were forced to amalgamate with the Ashkenazi community in the 1670s. So, what are we seeing here? Maybe a clash of styles. The Yekas and the Ostjuden are being forced together, and these immigrant newcomers are perhaps being seen as more exotic or emotional. Just like today, the choice of chazan for the shul serves as a strong symbol of the community's specific culture, whose sonic profile can either be the subject of fascination or, as in Amsterdam, of dissent. Today in shuls, cantors and rabbis who are davening are often running multiple Jewish edot. They're running multiple Jewish soundscapes at once. Ashkenazi davening, then it changes to chazonis, then it changes to American folk song or pop, then there's New Age chant. So the question of musical leadership for this era and ours is not just how does the beautiful of music point to the good of worship, but how do we musically stay a family? What musicians and music, what chazonim, express and contain us? I see I'm getting comments. I can't see them. If there's something urgent, tell David and he'll tell me. But the question still stands. How did it get this bad? Flying Ständers on Shabbos? Gewalt! To understand this, we have to go deeper into the history of the meshorerim. As we mentioned, these were small groups of 2 to 10 singers, at a minimum a bas, or low-voiced person, and a zinger was a boy or a high-voiced man. These were not like the choirs we know today, although they are like one type of ensemble that is very popular today. These meshorerim, they alternated with the cantor, they gave him a rest, they added embellishments and even wordless melodies, which we love so much, to the davening. Most of the manuscripts of these singers, which are held at HUC in Cincinnati in the Birnbaum collection, point to their singing in a Western Baroque style. In fact, they more often provided instrumental textures, seemingly imitating bassoons and flutes, and the like, rather than simply vocal textures. So we think of them really as the proto-a cappella groups. And they had spread to nearly all major Ashkenazi communities in Germany and Amsterdam and Poland by the 18th century and were the norm through the early 19th century. It was actually their excesses that Sulzer and the modernizers were trying to get rid of. And you can see them actually apparently on the blue, the Chazan, it looks like we're using sheet music in this particular example at the Amud. So again, this is when the beginning of actual sheet music as part of something that cantors have and do, is the emergence of Chochmat HaMuzika. Now, these groups are very popular, but also very controversial. And what do you do when you dislike something, but you are powerless to change it? Like an 18th century Twitter storm, many frustrated rabbis penned scathing critiques of these meshorerim and their cantorial leaders and sent them years later to the JTS library. And these things were all over the Amsterdam scene. Sefer Shirei Yehuda, 1697, Oy Vavoy, the Chazonim go on and on. They don't pay attention to the sodot of the tefillah, and they sing nonsense syllables, he says, like da 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 and la la la. This source, by the way, is one of the first references that I know of that we have to nonsense syllables in Jewish music. An indication perhaps that chazonim, that cantors, were part of the detaching of music from words, which eventually produced the emergence of the ever-popular Hasidic niggun. Now, later, Ketav Chacham Echad. This is in the JTS library. I'm sorry I don't have a higher res thing. I got this off of NLI. By a Sephardic rabbi, Isaac Atias, he visits from London, the Ashkenazi synagogues in Amsterdam in 1717, a little later. He complains, among many things, the Chazan does inappropriate tunes, so ek ad hashamayim, he screams. This is a main critique of Ashkenazi and Polish cantors. They scream and scream and scream, and they employ this boss with a heavy voice who does ridiculous gestures, and he puts his head on his shoulder and his hands on his face. All this ridiculous singing. But the mother of them all, a copy of which is also in the this copy is in the JTS library on the right. The one on the left, I believe, is in Amsterdam at a Chaim library. This is the mother lode of them. An anonymous 18th century Hebrew broadsheet entitled Shlosha Tzoakim Ve'enan Ne'enin. 3 scream, yet no one answers. This has all the anger of a suppressed subreddit. It's like if Dr. Seuss wrote a rhymed diatribe against cantors in the New York Times. But the author isn't even ready to face the public. He writes anonymously at the end that he has actually withheld his name Mipnei Amon Am Sheruach Shtut V'Shigaon Alehem Avar, because of the masses who have the spirit of wild madness come upon them. The author here directly implicates both German and Polish cantors. He describes them multiplying new melodies, having ridiculous personal deportment during prayer. They hold their ears, they grab their genitals, they bend over backwards while they're praying, all to hear their own voices. And that he lays into the bas and zinger, meshorerim, in the same ways we described above, and more, that they're ignorant in Torah reading and prayer. They extend one syllable to be so long until you can't understand what's being said. They don't go to shul, they have no kavanah, complete deplorables. So one particular, by the way, the manuscript of this is somewhere in New York. It's if someone wants to buy it, it's in an auction house. I'll tell you about it. But you have to share it with me one time. So one particular fascinating aspect of this source is, we're about to see it, good for your Hebrew readers, is the anonymous author's identification of the positive characteristics of prayer customs in a myriad of groups from all over the Jewish world. I think we get if you want to read, right there, I'll translate it. What is it our job to praise and our eyes to inspect, to see the customs of reach, of pleasant fragrance, of the kinsmen of Israel, who dwell under the kings of Ishmael, and the Italians, and the Berbers, and those who dwell in Peah, and the Sephardim who are scattered and dispersed, and all those who dwell in Babylon, and the kin who dwell under the people of fools, the inhabitants of Persia, India, Arabia, and the Ammonites. The majority of them sing pleasantly. They sing pleasantly with a clear voice. They speak the words properly, not one long next and the other short. And this is the correct path. There's a lot to say about this source, by the way, not the least of which is pointing to how musical expansion could be perceived, as in our previous source, to being at odds with rabbinic concerns about public morality and about piety and halacha. And yet the Rabbanim in this period, at least in Amsterdam, seem powerless to stop was der Public will, the type of music that the people want. But apparently this broadsheet here was so popular that it got reprinted in Prague and expanded. And not only was it expanded, but then a chazan read it and wrote a bilingual apologetic pamphlet against it, which is also in the JTS library, and on which I wrote my master's thesis. One could do a talk about the journey of this discourse about cantorial innovation and practice alone, but I want to point out one chiddush that comes from the expanded second edition we saw here, which I think looked at for the first time, and I don't know how long, in the Bodleian Library this past January of 2020. This is what the author he takes the original and adds new material, including things from the Kuzari, which most Ashkenazim didn't really read, but according to Adam, I'm going to forget his last name, at Pittsburgh, his research that in Prague is where Ashkenazi Jews actually read the Kuzari a bit, and this is what he adds to the conversation. He says, see the science of music and how it requires study. In bold is his additions. And the Levites in their youth constantly studied this science, for it is difficult to perfect, except as one is free from labor and is wealthy, who has liberty and riches. Look at the second essay of the Kuzari. And by the way, the text is obscured, so because of faces, so if I misread it, forgive me. The separation of the science of music was the specific providence of the Levites, who were free from all hard labor. Now, this is a critique of the Ashkenazi world, but different in some ways from the critiques that preceded it, in that it's calling for better musicianship, more music, and not less from the cantors and question. This makes the stunningly obvious point that sophisticated, good music takes time. In some ways, good music is the flower of religious civilization, which requires a lot of foundation to exist. Practice. What is chazanus without davening, right? Practice, inspiration, coordination, dedication. When people today wonder, what does the cantor do all day? Or what does the rabbi do all day? Scholarship and artistry take time, if we really believe in them, if we think they're part of a sacred mission. And so, if creating musical beauty, particularly for prayer, is religiously important, then what are we asking of those who spend their time doing it? We can see this way, by the way, in my opinion, totally alive today, and I'll say this at the risk of being slightly controversial, you can write me later. The cantor and the rabbi face the same questions. Will they be generalists or specialists? The Jewish world still wants good music, but in my opinion, it's actually restructured itself to push this work out of synagogues, which need to focus on building their foundations of relationships, finances, interpersonal mitzvot. It's non-synagogue centers like Hadar and Pardes and SLPC and the Rising Song Institute and the Cantors Assembly in some ways now, and even university Jewish studies departments that have filled the void of specialization in Torah, Mada, and Chochmat HaMuzika, at least in their own areas of interest. So, as clergy and creatives, we need to think holistically about how the Jewish world works, and perhaps reconsider how Jewish creativity and music should be supported in both pulpit and non-pulpit contexts. Now, two more things before we close. I promised you I'd give you some jokes. And here's a Purim spiel. In this era, we see that the Chazan is experimenting with both new sounds and new ideas about music and expanded musical forces in the form of meshorerim. And indeed, Ashkenazi Jews seem willing to deal with their ambivalence about this phenomenon through humor. One of the earliest complete Purim spiels that we have in Yiddish opens with Haman played by the cantor. Now, I think this is a common thing. I always have played Haman as the cantor. I didn't know I was part of a Masorah. I didn't know I was part of a real tradition in doing this. And this comes from Poland in about 1697. And lo and behold, Haman declares these first cantorial lines. He says, Ostragi, Ostragi, ala Yuda by Bagi. Carry out the furniture, because when you did a Purim spiel back then, it was in a room, and you used the furniture for a set. All Jews listen, make an alley, give Haman space. I am called Herr Betzter Hamon bin ich genannt. I am called Haman the Best. I am well versed in all knavery and childish pranks. And then says Schreiber, scribe, wir werden singen zwischen Tenor und Bass. Scribe, we will sing descant, tenor, and bass. The parlor room shall ring gleich vom ein Hohlfass, just like an empty barrel. And then who should arrive? But literally, they're written into the script. It's the meshorerim, and they say, hey, we've come, looking really good. We want to sing for the king and the queen. And they sing. They have a song. This is what they sing. So perhaps this is the cantor and his meshorerim themselves playing Haman, making light of whatever tensions are in the air. Or maybe it's the yeshiva bachur making fun of their local leaders. Whether they are or not, we should note that there can be tension when we add to the musical leadership of the service, right? Will those singers be trusted or pious or as prepared as the leader? Will they come with their hearts and heads as well as their voices? So, in some times it's yes, and sometimes definitely no. And we see that resolved and dealt with in this little Purim spiel. Now, finally, this is perhaps the most significant book in early modern cantorial history, which you mentioned previously, Tudat Shlomo by Rabbi Shlomo Lifshitz. It's a 100-page manual of cantorial Musar, custom, and Torah. Rabbi Shlomo learned from his father, who was a rabbi and chazan in Fürth, for 50 years. That's around just short of the same amount of time that Salman Zulzer was a chazan in Vienna. He learned from his father in Fürth. He was a prize yeshiva bacher at the yeshiva in Nickelsburg under David Oppenheim. And he wanted to be working in music and devote himself to all the details of prayer, its Kabbalistic sodot, its secrets, and its intentions. And he had believed in the potential for moving people through sophisticated music. This is how he opens his book. And this gets back to that image of the priest. And you forgive you again. My translation is okay. And please, if you have comments on it, please send me later. This is how he opens his book. Sefer Or Yisrael, in the Sefer Or Yisrael, in the name of Sefer Hecha HaKodesh, one must know the reason for why the only appropriate work on Yom Kippur is that of the high priest. You already know that the secret of the high priest is compassion, and on this holy day, the day of atonement and forgiveness and mercy, it must be that the quality of chesed, of compassion, overcomes the quality of judgment. This is perfect for the Omer, right? Since if there is no compassion, there is no atonement and forgiveness. And if you come all upon a kohen hediyot, a common priest who is inclined toward justice, perhaps the mercy will be tainted and diluted with judgment. So on this day, the shaliach must be mercy, that is compassion which does not stand on judgment and forego anger, etc. And then at the end, he says, we have no high priest, we only have the shaliach tzibur, which is the cantor, the chazan. The chazan has to be in the place of the high priest. Tam b'yashar, right? Pure and straightforward and steadfast, forgoing anger, as we said before. And if he has a voice and which is pleasant to the humanity, of course it will be pleasant to the Spirit of God, as it is written. So to me, this is a very deep image, and I've taught this image to many cantors and rabbis, and it continues to strike me how beautiful it is and how telling it is. In being a leader of prayer, and particularly of musical prayer, one must seek the pure shlichut of the congregation, their consent as a representative. And so too, knowing that there is a bond of chesed, of love, that you carry them in your heart as their prayer leader, is intimately tied up with the music that you produce, which evokes both their emotions and the precision required when you are doing something that fully represents them halachically and otherwise. Okay, that's from a previous presentation. So I'm going to close in saying, to conclude, in this pandemic, we know that one of the most profound things we want to feel is that we're not alone. And so too for the leader of prayer and for the musician whose offering brings them in communion with people and especially with God. There's a lot of good that needs to be done. And then as now, cantors and musicians must ask the question, how can my gifts and my capabilities and my leadership, the beauty in music that God has given me to create, point to that which is good, that which is beyond me? How do the musical choices I make create a system of values, evoke harmony, or point to the brokenness in my community? And how can I avoid the pitfalls that come with the possibilities of musical artistry and sophistication? So I know this talk has been half Musar and half scholarship, and I hope that this journey into the striking era of cantorial innovation inspires each of you to consider your own leadership and your own gifts, whether it's in music or art or any expressive channel, and think about how you can use it to beautify the mitzvot that God has given each of us to do. So I thank you for your time and will now entertain questions and comments from the floor.
Matt, beautiful. I mean, it's so fascinating. I'll say two things. First of all, I can't wait to read your dissertation turned into a book, because if it's this material and more, it's going to be fascinating. Given both the joy and wisdom you communicated, I want you to be my chazan, but we'll talk about that. Okay, we did get one question in the course of your presentation. Somebody wanted to know about the Sephardi community in Amsterdam at the same time and whether they were affected by any of these musical controversies. And
Yes.
then I'll look for other questions coming into chat as you're responding to that.
Please, and thank you, Tamara, so much for that. And I apologize. One of my things I have to work on for nearing every Yom Kippur and throughout the year is speaking too fast. So if there was something was too fast and you wanted to hear about it, please write me. I'll put my email in the chat, and you can write me after this. Sephardic Jews are such an interesting case because unlike the Ashkenazi Jews, when they come to communities like Amsterdam and like Italy, the Ashkenazi Jews have an existing tradition that they're bringing. A lot of the Sephardi Jews are more wealthy, and they're new Christians. They're building their tradition a little more from scratch, and not entirely. They have Judeo-Spanish, they have some, but their learning is a less thick. And so in a lot of Sephardim, both in some ways in Arabic lands and in Spain and in Western Europe where Sephardim come, they take on the host culture's music culture a little more whole hog. Forgive me using that in the Jewish setting, right? The Sephardim take on art music and are writing cantatas and have cantorial singing competitions in the 18th century. The Ashkenazim are poorer when they come to Amsterdam. They're in the minority in the beginning, even though they've become the majority. Same thing in Italy. The Ashkenazim, when they come, the Sephardim are the place where Rossi gets played. Like all of the art music experiments happen really more in the Sephardi context. The Ashkenazim, and this is really in some ways where the roots of Chazonis comes from. The Ashkenazim are learning music, and I'm trying to figure this out in the course of my dissertation, more from the improvisational traditions that are in the streets of Europe, more than from the more courtly elite traditions of pre-composed music that we know from Rossi. And so the Sephardim are actually way more in on Chokhmat HaMuzika. That is in Sephardi writings, the Chokhmat HaMuzika and discourse about harmony and music theory really comes into Judaism, into Judaism in general. Ashkenazi Judaism picks up this stuff much later. I don't think we have any. I think Isserlein is one in like the 14th or 15th century, is one of the first Ashkenazi people to even quote anything about Chokhmat HaMuzika and these modern things. So the main point is the Sephardim are, and in the Arabic lands, they're taking on makam. They take on the Turkish, chord system of music. So the Ashkenazim are a little more feisty, especially the Polish Ashkenazim, right? Are feisty with their tradition, and they hold on to it. And there's this beautiful creative interplay between West and the Yidden.
Ruth Golden asks about your opinion. I mean, reflecting as you are on musical culture, what does that lead you to in considering musical instruments today in the synagogue?
This is a great question. Thank you, Ruth. My opinion on instruments is this. Number one, ask your Mara Da'atra, because they're halachic things that have to do with your own specific community is number one. From a practical perspective, my experience is that the more you add, whether it's singers, whether it's instrumentalists, the more power you have. But in Judaism, you have to be wary of power because power can easily point to you. So I think the more instruments you have, the more careful you have to be. The most engaged davenings that I've been to with instrumentalists, I know actually that the instrumentalists have like prayed before together. One of the things I've always thought that should be done, that you should take this home to your communities, Kenahara, is that it would be great if like when you had a choir, if everyone they walked up for Musaf or whatever, everyone laid hands. I mean, not in COVID times, but laid hands and blessed the choir, saying, "Atem shlichai, right? Atem shlichai, you are my shlichim before God." And if you trust somebody that they're not just singing about themselves, not just creating beauty for themselves, then of course get up there and sing, right? That's why there's this inverse, when kids get up and sing, it's not just about them. It's about something bigger. The younger the kid, the more people actually pay attention to them when they're leading, right? It's a bizarre inversion of of kavod in Judaism, but it's beautiful, right? So the main point is that my operating hypothesis is the more that you build, the more trust and consent you need to build. Because what you don't want is, hey, they're having all the fun, and I'm part of this other group of people that just isn't cool enough to have as much fun as those cool kids up there. You want to feel like you are connected to the shlichus, to the shlichut of the people involved. So that's if you can do that, I think it works.
That's great. Do we have scores of the music, say, from the Amsterdam community in the 17th century? And reflecting the different preferences of the different communities?
So what we have to remember here is that even the idea of written music is written music is its own ideology. Having written music is its own ideology, right? It actually, in some ways, defines some of the differences in the way rabbis and cantors are often socialized. Rabbis are predominantly socialized into oral cultures of music, right? You get the music via relationship. It's not written down, right? Chazonim, even though cantorial music is come down to us orally, and it's an oral tradition, and you can't take a piece of sheet music and sound like a chazan. We are a lot more comfortable with written musical traditions, and it's just that oral versus written culture is very, very different. And indeed, up until 1750, Jews are operating from oral models of music, and so we begin in 1750, and these are mostly in the tons of the stuff at HUC in Cincinnati in the Birnbaum collection. Edwin Birnbaum was the first sort of father of Jewish musicology in the 19th century, and he lectured at my university, Halle Wittenberg, where Zunz and all these rabbis in the Breslau seminary went. Anyway, he collected all these things. These are writing downs of an oral tradition, and they're mostly from 1750 through the early 19th century.
Great.
So
I have I'm going to put you on the spot for the last question here. You've been very generous with your time, but I'm sure you'll be generous with your spirit as well. I wonder, what is the moment that you identify as the moment of your greatest musical inspiration?
Oh my goodness. The moment of my greatest musical inspiration is not, I can't identify it with an experience. I'll tell you what's coming to me right now. When I was, and this may be a little far afield or not, I mean, I've had musical highs in all sorts of environments. I go to the opera, I was on Joey Weisenberg's first CD, and being in that circle of people who were so sensitive and so musical was so powerful and transformative. I'll tell you this story, which is really from why I became a cantor. I studied voice in Vienna, Austria, which is where I fell in love with chazonis. That's where Solomon Zulzer Synagogue was, and they still have chazan with choir, and it's more like an a cappella group than a choir. I mean, they have sheet music sometimes, but they're alive. And wherever the chazan goes, they're ready with their amecho, ready with their harmonizations. I love that live music. But my voice teacher, whose name is Paulette, she was a minister's daughter from West Virginia, and she moved to Vienna, she's still there, when she was 19 years old. And she talked about, and we would talk about in our lessons, how music is a gift from God, right? It shows you lessons for how you live your life. And so you put a tone out there into the world, and people may judge it, people will think up whatever about it, but you have to give it, and that's love, right? And you hold and focus on your tone just like you're rocking a baby. And it was that, realization that, wow, my gifts that Hashem has given me are actually a way into my spirituality. That was like the high moment that really transformed. It was shortly after that I decided, okay, I want to go to cantorial school because I want to give my spiritual life a chance. And I think that's, one of the beautiful things that the cantor continues to do is it captures people for whom it was their musical experience that gave them their sense of purpose and meaning, and it harnesses them for good. It takes the beauty that Hashem has given them and makes it a hidur of his mitzvot.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you for being so generous with your time and your voice and your spirit and your research. Really wonderful program. I
did something about Amsterdam.
So much. And I want to invite everybody who's here. First of all, thank you for joining us. But we have 2 other musical programs on subsequent Thursdays during this month. At the same time, Thursday evenings next week, April 22nd, is the Jewish music of Leonard Bernstein, a presentation by Chazan David Tillman. And on April 29th, the music of the Abba Yudaya. And it's a report on that music and on Cantor's Assembly. In Uganda, the presenter on that will be Dr. Amanda Rupenthal-Stein and Chazan Jeremy Stein. These will be also, fabulous, informative programs, and we really encourage you to come back. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much, everybody. I'm going to put my, if you like studying with me, I'm hosting, by the way, at the end of the month, starting on the 25th, a 3-part series on specifically Italian Jewish music traditions, which are lecture concerts on Sunday afternoons. And so you can go to cantors.org for more information, or you can email me at mattausterklein@gmail.com, and I'm happy to share that with you.
Okay.
I would like to tell you something about my experience in Amsterdam.
Okay, I'll stay on for a little bit. Tell me, Israel.
Okay. 45 years ago, I auditioned for Shabbat in an Orthodox Ashkenazic synagogue in Amsterdam. I stayed with a rabbi.